just want to say thanks for the opportunity to be here and putting this presentation together. I really learned a lot about what our America's history with alternative varietals is, and I would use that as a basis going forward to discuss exactly what the potential is for these wines in America. But I thought it was really good to look at our history with it first, and it turned out to be quite fascinating. And I think we'll have quite a bit of fun with this. To get some bearings, my first decision was, let's look at some. I took a look at the California Harvest Report for 2015, and these are the top 5 grapes that were picked in California, and the top 5 red grapes. Very interestingly, you have French Colombard, which is kind of one of our workhorse grapes. Pinot Gris you would expect because of the Pinot Grigio action. Muscat of Alexandria, obviously, and that's because of the Moscato craze. And so these are all fairly common and pretty popular varietals. We had a total of 43 different grapes. For red varietals, pretty standard, Cabernet Zinfandel, Merlot, Pinot Noir, you'd expect to see this. And then you've got Ruby Red, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. But we had a total of 62 varietals. Getting on this site, it was quite interesting. We had a chance to actually go back and look at what California was doing 40 years ago. French Colombard and Chenin Blanc comprised 68% of the total white production, white grapes harvested in 75. 75 is a very interesting year. It's a year before the Taste of Paris Summit, where we all of a sudden became very popular wines. We have Palomino, Emerald Riesling, we'll talk a little bit about that grape later, and Burger. I don't know how many of you guys know what Burger is. That has consistently been one of the top 10 grapes produced in California. I have no idea what it is or what it does, but just love the name. I've never seen a 100% varietal Burger either. Red grapes, very interesting. Carignan, Grenache, Barbera, Ruby Cabernet, Valdepeñas. Every one of those grapes, Carignan, Grenache, and Barbera, were above 100 tons harvested in California. Noticeably less varietals, 29 to 37, but very, very, very different set of varietals that were part of the California wine scene. And what was really fascinating is that seeds of grapes that were listed in 75 and are no longer around on the list of grapes picked in 2015. And some of you guys may have heard of some of these grapes, but I love Ferjes Zagos. Catarato, I've seen a little bit of that. I think there's some out there in the Chalmers Vineyard, maybe. Peverella, Helena, no idea. Red grapes, Saint Macaire, that's a Bordeaux varietal. Griot, some you might have seen that. Lenoir is a Rhone varietal. Peclan, Aramon. So we really had back then a really amazing, diverse viticultural history of alternative, what we would call today alternative varietals. But these are actually they were part of California's viticultural history for quite a bit of time. So I worked as a retailer in San Francisco and worked at a store, brick and mortar store called the Jug Shop. And I decided to kind of take a look at the history of alternative varietals in California as viewed through what we did at the Jug Shop. We're going to talk a little bit about these various phases of alternative varietals and how they probably are part of our retail set. In just about every case where I list a wine, we actually sold multiple cases of these wines in our store. So these weren't just like one-off kind of let's try something. They actually had traction and were part of our retail set. And it was very, very lucky to work in a city and in a store which allowed us to get off to what might be called alternative, I call them kinky varietals. I have a couple other names a little bit later, so hopefully there'll be a few jokes in there. But we start off with tradition and history, and this would be pre-1986. I started working in '86. We'll talk about why these wines had tradition and history. Frankenstein's, respect for what we had planted in California, America's unique alternatives, the alternative wine trend that happened, and of course the renewal of interest in alternative varietals as done by our sommelier and hipster community. When I say tradition and history, when we participated at the Jug Shop, if you had any serious wine store, you of course had Bordeaux, you might have had California wines, but if you did not have any of these varietals, you did not have a proper selection of wines. Green Hungarian is a very obscure varietal. Weibel was the name. They basically were the only producer of Green Hungarian and did it for decades. Grey Riesling, it was actually Trousseau Gris. That's Wente Brothers. When I went to an all-boys school, college, and there was a girls' school across the street, and I knew I was not a sports guy, and I wasn't going to be a beer guy, and I thought Wente Brothers was going to be my secret weapon. I was going to go to the coffee shop, get my little sweater on, read poetry, drink coffee, smoke cigarettes, and use wine as the secret weapon, and it did not work. At Wente Brothers, the wines are good, but it just didn't work. That French Colombard that you saw in our 2015 harvest, Almaden, basically 4-liter French Colombard, was the workhorse wine in California. Rick Scatelli, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but Kincannon was a Livermore Valley winery that was probably the only producer of that. But that was just people, you just carried that wine because you couldn't pronounce it. And it was very, very popular. That's Livermore Valley, which was basically the birthplace of California Chardonnay. And red varietals, Louis Martini Barbera was it. Charbonneau. There's actually a Charbonneau Society that has been promoting and drinking Charbonneau since the 1960s, 70s. And if you didn't have Inglenook Charbonneau, you were just not a cool store. Grignolino from Heights Cellars, Italian varietal, probably the only producer of that. The wine today is more sold as a rosé, but Grignolino as a red wine was very important. Napa Gamay, which actually Valdiguay, the actual Gamay that we thought in Napa Valley was Gamay Beaujolais was actually a Valdiguay. Robert Medida, you had to do that. And Petit Syrah, of course. So these are all grapes that were part of our set. And if you didn't have them, you'd have to order them in like every 3-6 months and reorder. But these were part of any California, San Francisco set, in addition to all the Cabernets and things like that. So when I started, these are grapes we just became familiar with. They were just part of our wine community. One of the things that we also had that was very interesting was what I call Frankenstein wines. And these are wines basically made at UC Davis. After Prohibition, we didn't really have much of a viticultural department, and we didn't really have proper. So we had to. So UC Davis was charged with finding grapes that could be used for mass production, a lot easier to grow and harvest, and they were really made for production and not for quality. But what turns out that there are actually wines made from these grapes that we ended up selling a couple years after I started working at it. Flora, which is a cross between Gewürztraminer and Semillon that was made in 1938. That was used as a sparkling wine by Schramsberg. Symphony, which is Muscat and Alexandria, crossed with Grenache Gris. Usually as a sweet wine, there was one winery that actually made 3 different symphonies: dry, sweet, and dessert wine. Emerald Riesling, which was another grape that's very, very popular. We saw that in one of the in the 1975 list of wines. And Chateau LaSalle, which is Christian Brothers, made a Emerald Riesling that was quite popular. Carmine, cross between Cabernet, Carignan, and Merlot. Ruby Cabernet, which you actually make. There's quite a bit of Ruby Cabernet grown in Australia. Ridge Winery was making varietal bottled Ruby Cabernets in the 70s. That was part of their introduction to, they didn't have enough Cabernet Montebello, so they needed other grapes. And Ruby Red, which is one of the top 5 grapes grown in California today. America had a very interesting phase right about when I started working in the late 80s and early 90s, which is really kind of discovery of a lot of grapes that were already existing in vineyards that people kind of said, wait, what have we got here? We should really make some wines out of this. There were 2 important events. One was the beginning of Glen Ellen Winery. Glen Ellen was very famous for developing the term proprietor's reserve, and then selling the wine for $3.99 a bottle. Their production was so strong that they basically just agreed to buy a farmer's entire harvest. So many of those field blend vineyards, what they would do is just buy everything. So they were putting reds together, and they kind of realized, wait a second, we've got a lot of weird grapes here. What can we do with them? Why put them in a weird blend? Let's make something out of it. So they created a winery called Imagery Series. And if you look at the Royaux up there, Imagery, Cabernet Pfeffer, and also Trousseau. So in the 86 and 87, they basically came with an artist series, assigned every wine a painting designed by some artist. They always had to have an Acropolis because that's where the Benzinger family smoked weed while they parents made the Glen Ellen. So there's always an Acropolis picture. There's actually an Acropolis at the top of the hill at the winery. And then instead of selling it in the $3.99 Glen Ellen Proprietors Reserve Red and Magnums, charged $16 to $20 a bottle for it. So they really kind of came out with these weird grapes, and we were like, wow, these are fun, let's try these. So with red varietals, you got Arboreaux. We had an Alicante Boucher that Wellington Winery in Sonoma Valley made, Cabernet Pfeffer. Cinsault was very popular. Frick is a producer of that. Criolla, the Michigan grape, also known as Pais. Lemberger was one of my favorite wines. That's actually technically Blaufränkisch, but it's a very popular grape in Washington. And the reason we sold a crap load of that is our shelf talker said, Lemberger for your hamburger. And it just out the door. Muscat Hamburg, which is a dessert wine made at Philip Tony up in Negrette, Wild Horse. Pinot St. George, which is also Negrette, made by a winery called Enns. They're about 80-year-old vines. In 1981, one of the first articles that talked about Pinot Noir in the New York Times had a list of Pinot Noirs, and they put Pinot St. George's in there as well, thinking they were also Pinot Noirs. So we've come a long way since 91 in understanding that. Trousseau, Val de Grès. And then you had Sauvignon Vert, which made vines planted in the 1940s, Sylvaner, Trousseau Gris. Aleatico made as a rosé by Imagery Series. So these were really a great time to be discovering these wines and promoting them. They were different. They had a place, and we sold these wines. They were just, again, part of our mix of wines. We had a weird red section, and we had a weird white section between the Sauvignon Blancs and the Cabernets, and they just sold very well. And they had great stories and really points of difference in what worked. We also in America have, grapes are not just grown on the West Coast. There's grapes grown all over the United States. Wines are actually made in every one of the 50 states. Many are not grown, but 50 states produce wine. And one of the things that really brought us to wines brought outside of California was a winery, a restaurant called One Market, and their goal was to make wines only from the United States on their wine list. And in California, that meant we couldn't get access to many of these wines from other states, so an enterprising distributor put together a portfolio of wines from Missouri, Virginia, Long Island, Finger Lakes, Michigan. We had all these different wine regions that just came into San Francisco all at once. And as a result of that, we had got exposed to some really interesting wines. Well, most of these things are actually not Vitis vinifera. These are wines that are grown in various states, and they're different species. They're Vitis, but Vitis labrusca, Vitis rotundifolia. I've never heard of that one. Estivalis. So these are actually grapes, but different species. Catawba is very popular in Ohio. Scuppernong is very popular in Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. Sable Blanc's a very New York popular. I love Traminette, that's a great name. That is the official state wine of Indiana. Just so you know that. Vidal Blanc, Vignoles. These ones that don't have it, these are basically crosses, either done in vineyards or done at universities, but they're crosses of different species. Baco Noir from Oregon, Chambourcin, one of the best Chambourcins I've tasted, very northern run style from Pennsylvania. Concord grapes, which is basically the backbone of Manischewitz, which is probably one of the largest wines as kosher wine, and that is the founding of Constellation. Constellation Winery basically is Manischewitz made with Concord grapes. Muscadine and the Norton, which was first grown in Missouri in 1820. And by the 1840s, it was considered America's most popular grape, finest grape, and won numerous gold medals in France a couple decades later. Norton is really, it's really considered a very popular grape in Virginia, and the East Coast is very sturdy, and it's done very well there. And for maybe 2 or 3 of these we didn't get because we could get access to Scuppernong or Vigno or Muscadine, but every one of those other wines, we carried examples from that at Jug Shop and sold them. In the late 80s, we started to see a little bit more of, instead of buying stuff that was already existing in their vineyards and existing in other states, we actually had people starting to go overseas to look for new varietals. And that largely, that was really fun, started by the Rhone Revolution, which was, Cigar Volant and the Bonnie Doon really getting a renewed interest in alternative varietals from the Rhone Valley. We already had plenty of Syrah, Grenache, but the real beginning of reaching out to other markets to bring new varietals into the country was, the white varietals, because we didn't have access to those, and some of the kind of more obscure of the 13 road reds like Coudoise. We also had a big surge in Italian interest in Italian. Sangiovese's first vintage was 1988. Robert Pepe did that. And as a result of that, we saw a lot more interest in Dolcetto and Nebbiolo grown up north, and then maybe another 5 to 10 years later, more interest in what was grown down south as we become more exposed to southern varietals. And we also had this, various other little grapes that really made a kind of interesting statement at our store, Dornfelder, which is one of the darkest wines I've ever seen. We did $30 Dornfelder at retail. Pinotage, of course, that was pretty easy. I love Tannat. That came in one day. We had there were only probably 3 producers of Tannat in all of California, and they all happened to come in on the same day to show their wines. It was just like 3 different producers of Tannat. We have a big tradition in the States of having promotional organizations like the Society of Blancs, Pinot Noir Society, ZAP for Zinfandel. And my girlfriend decided we needed to have a Tannat one. It was called Tits for Tannat. And it's really not what you think it is. That's
just as well.
It's Tannat is. I forgot my joke. This is what I always do. I'll come back to Tits for Tannat. Anyway, Albarino, Gruner Valley.
Let's just speed this one bit up.
Yeah,
okay?
sorry.
Thank you. That's all right. Love you, but.
And then we go, the Psalms and hipsters speak. This is contemporary what's happening right now. Notice no grapes, because they haven't brought anything new to the country. There aren't really any new varietals that really have been brought into California that have really made an impact on the retail market. Largely, this is due to the fact that what's happening right now, especially with alternative varietals, is that and the new move towards natural wines, is that we're using traditional varietals already here. So with things like Chenin Blanc, is particularly well. Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, Nero d'Avola, grapes like that. Those are what kind of the forefront of where natural wines are being made. So they're kind of using existing stuff. Trousseau is another one, but the Trousseau that they're looking at is not the Bastardo grape that Trousseau was known for in the 80s when we first carried those wines. They're a much lighter version that's shown in the Jura.
Sure.
Okay, I've spent a lot of time talking about my store and my country's involvement with alternative, weird, kinky, different varietals. So what's the real story behind all of this? And I think that when you pull back and really look at America's winemaking history, the traditional varietals that we all assume are the backbone of our country's wine industry, Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot, today are really part of a larger matrix of grapes that we deal with. It's only recently that grapes like Chardonnay and Cabernet have come to dominate wine production in the States. In reality, the alternative varietals in America have not been Scuppernongs or Norton. It's really the Chardonnays and Cabernets that are America's alternative varietals, as they've only recently landed on America's wine scene. So what's the place of Australia's group of alternative varietals and their potential in America? Well, 10 to 15 years ago, when I first encountered your country's Tempranillos and Zinfandels and was asked that same question, I quickly and emphatically asserted wineries do not make the effort to sell them on our shores, and instead focus on the varietals that have brought them success so far. Focus on Shiraz, GSMs, Semillons, and Rieslings. And I said that because I think that the imported varietals that sell best in a country like America and have the largest impact are those that bring flavors and wine styles that are not being produced by the wine industry of the importing country. America can't do Tempranillo. We can't do Malbec. And that accounts for the success of Argentinian and Spanish wines in our country. Who else makes a Savvy like Marlborough, which is why we import so much of it? Who can do a Barossa Shiraz? Only Australia. But does America really need more Chardonnay? We have plenty of our own, which is one reason why we don't really import a lot of premium Chardonnay from other countries. So when I first encountered an Australian Vermentino and a New Zealand Gruner Veltliner in America, I confidently predicted limited success and reminded everyone that years ago to keep slugging away at the wines that brought them to the table. And you know what? I fucked up. These wines are finding a home on the shelves of wine lists in America. They are selling through. Maybe not a lot right now, as very few of these alt wines are coming to our shores, but their presence and success are readily apparent.
And I should have remembered that many, many years ago, we proudly sold cases of Brown Brothers Tarango. So I should have known that some success was possible. So what's really happening here? There's two things. For one, with many of the alternative varietals that I've encountered from New Zealand and Australia, I've seen a brightness, a freshness, a liveliness to the wines that are decidedly different than the examples coming from the Northern Hemisphere. They are exciting examples of what these grapes can do both here and across the Tasman. And this could be due to the younger age of the vines than what we might be found in the so-called mother country. There could also be less genetic or clonal diversity. I also think that the rays of the sun in Australia and New Zealand, thanks to lesser pollution and haze than one might see in the dirty and murky air of the Northern Hemisphere, have more of a direct path to the grape skin. And that's what provides wines with its flavors, colors, and aromas. And this may be another reason why these Vermentinos and Gruners from the Southern Hemisphere are so bright and juicy and why they have achieved some modest success in the States. But more importantly, why is the retail wine buyer or somm buying that wine? What's getting them to select a wine that's not in Australia's traditional wheelhouse? Well, I have a theory here, and we all know how difficult it is to get American gatekeepers to try any wine, let alone Australian wine. And I think that both countries have a perceived so-called comfort factor that causes many buyers to shrug and go, Australia, yeah, they do Shiraz and Semillon. New Zealand does Savvy and Pinot. I don't need to try any more of these wines. I know what they're doing. But pull out an example of a familiar varietal that these countries are not normally known for doing, and the buyer perks up and says, wow, I didn't know they do that. And once they try the wine, that fresh and bright style, and often at a very good price-value relationship compared to the Northern Hemisphere counterpart, gets the buyer to pull the trigger. And more importantly, these new wines provide our country with a fresh and new insight into what your wine industry is currently doing, and providing that new perspective is an immeasurable benefit. These are really heady days for those who are exploring untraditional varietals in Australia. There's lots of interest. Wines are selling. Everybody's taste buds are excited for these new sensations. But I think there's a few words of caution to be noted. And I know it's very competitive out there. And as a winery, who wants to compete in the big world out there, slogging it out on the Chardonnay and Cabernet segments of the market? Standing out and being different can bring rewards, awareness, success, popularity. And just as you have the Granite Belt staking its claim as Australia's alt wine region, California has Lodi Valley doing the same thing, making Verdelhos, Cinsault, and other grapes coming out as this region strives to make some noise above the state's notoriety for Cab and Pinot, forsaking the Zinfandel and Petit Syrah that paid the bills in Lodi Valley for over a century. Traditional varietals are popular for a reason. Large segments of the wine-drinking population love Chardonnay and Cabernet. And there's a strong urge to go all in with these new varietals. But remember that you're also businesses that have to pay some bills. You must survive financially. And don't forget that classic wines are in demand, and they can pay the bills while keeping your brand in the public eye. And with those consumers who may not want to explore those wines because they're just not there yet. But what's really important is I don't think Americans realize that not long ago, Aussie winemakers rarely encountered the diverse varietals and styles that we in America, and particularly in California, take for granted. I can recall Australian winemakers visiting me at the jug shop and asking them what they wanted to drink for dinner. And inevitably, they'd be going to some obscure Italian, Spanish wine over, and I'm sitting there going, don't you want a California Chardonnay or a Pinot Noir, something that we do here? Always to the weird wines. But to them, to see them relish in the delight as they encountered aromas and textures they had never experienced before taught me a lot about how isolated many Australian winemakers were from the larger wine world. And I will never forget that sense of wonder and excitement that they expressed as these new sensations enveloped them. And I also recall back then, I often forgot how lucky I was to work at a store like the Jug Shop in a market like San Francisco that allowed both consumers and the trade to experience such a broad view of our country's own wines, as well as wines from across the globe. I mean, seriously, Lemberger for your hamburger. But what's really special about Australians' involvement with these different varietals is that sense of discovery and curiosity that's bringing you to the table as you explore these new grapes and wine styles. We may be a bit jaded in America because in addition to the explorations of the rich and varied tapestry that makes up our own country's viticultural heritage, most of us have already experienced many of the varietals you are just now investigating from appellations that first produced them. But nothing could make us more interested in what you're doing than witnessing the passion and verve that all Australian winemakers possess as you show us what this new part of the wine industry is capable of accomplishing. And while you search for your own expression of Tempranillo or Fiano or whatever, that's pretty infectious stuff. And if you keep showing us that energy and curiosity and that passion, we'll follow you anywhere you want to take us.
Oh.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chuck.